My name is Amber Reyes. I am 34 years old and have had many titles in my life: Marine, Rear, Sister, Daughter. But which title do I miss the most lately? Invisible. After all, I have given years in uniform, months away from home, lost vacations and memories exchanged for silence. I returned, expecting not a parade but maybe a seat at the table. Instead, I found my picture missing from the wall, my name mentioned as an afterthought, and a family dinner where the only thing waiting for me was an empty tableware with no knife. The only person who saw me that night, the waiter, and all he said was, "Thank you for your service. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever been in a crowded place where everyone knew your name, but still felt completely invisible and empty?" I know that sounds unbelievable, but if it sounds familiar, then stay with me for a moment. We're not alone in this, because what happened next, it changed everything. Let me take you back to when things started going downhill. It was a Tuesday. Late afternoon. The sun was already dipping low over Fayetteville, throwing long shadows across the sidewalk outside my apartment. I had just walked back from the old base out of habit more than anything. I still knew the drill. The rhythm of the place stuck with me even after discharge. Left foot, right foot, check the corners. Breathe through your nose. Don't make noise unless you need to. Funny how muscle memory doesn't forget you, even when people do. When I got inside, I set the keys down gently, like I was trying not to wake anyone even though no one else lived there. There was a cup of black coffee still sitting on the kitchen counter. Half full, cold. I'd made it that morning and walked away before drinking it. That happens more than I'd like to admit. I tossed my canvas bag on the couch. A folded flyer slipped out and landed face up on the rug. Translating military experience into civilian careers. Printed in big hopeful letters as if the right verbs could turn deployments into office-ready bullet points. I picked it up, stared at it, then left it where it was. The apartment was quiet. Not the peaceful kind. The loud kind. Quiet that pressed against your ears like static. Quiet that reminded you no one was coming home after you. That no one would ask how your day went, or even notice if you didn't come back. I stood in the middle of the room, not moving, not really thinking. Then, without meaning to, I walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out a photo frame. It was one of the few pictures I'd kept from active duty. Me in uniform. Standing stiff, squinting into sunlight. A little younger, a little harder. Still believing service was the answer. The glass had cracked a year ago when the frame fell during a storm. I never replaced it. Just taped it back together like it didn't bother me. That's when I saw it on the fridge. Sunday. 6 p.m. Family dinner. It was scribbled on the magnetic notepad my mother gave me years ago. The kind with pastel flowers in the corner. The kind she probably still thinks I use for grocery lists. I'd written it there 2 weeks ago after her call. She didn't ask how I was doing. Didn't ask if I was working or sleeping or anything really. Just said, "You'll be there Sunday, right? Don't drift this time, Amber." That word stuck to me like smoke drift. I wanted to ask her, when exactly did I start drifting? Was it the day I signed up? The day I shipped out? Or was it the day I stopped asking for permission? I didn't ask. I just said, "Sure, Sunday." And then I hung up and stared at the notepad for a long time. Back in the present, I walked over to my small desk by the window. There was a file folder sitting there, resume drafts, a half-finished cover letter, sticky notes that said things like keywords equals project MGMT logistics coordination. Civilian words, softened versions of the hard things I've done. I opened the file and stared at the section labeled Career Summary. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, then pulled back. What could I even write? Led strategic supply operations in hostile territory? Or maybe kept people alive when everything else went to hell? Would that translate to team player with multitasking skills? Would it matter? I sat there for a while. No music, no television. Just the tick of the wall clock behind me. Then I closed the laptop gently, turned off the light, and stood there with the photo still in my hand. There's something strange about being needed once, and then not at all. But I hadn't walked away yet. because part of me still hoped someone might notice. Next up, family dinner. The place where you're supposed to feel most at home. Except, that's not always how it works. Let me tell you what happened when I walked through that door. Let me tell you what I remember most about leaving for boot camp. It wasn't the duffel bag or the airport or even the weight of the uniform in my hands. It was the way my father stood on the porch, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon like I was already gone. My mother kept wringing her hands like she was trying to hold something in, maybe a goodbye she couldn't bring herself to say. And my little brother, he was the only one who looked me in the eye. I didn't cry. I didn't hug anyone too long. But just before I turned to go, he pulled a little necklace out of his hoodie pocket. A cheap silver compass on a worn chain. He said, "So you can find your way back." I wore it under my uniform every single day. Looking back now, I don't think I was running to something. I think I was running for someone. My family was going through it. My dad had just lost his job. My mom was working double shifts at the clinic, and I kept hearing my name in the middle of their whispered arguments. She's got to figure out what she's doing. She can't just float forever. So I made a choice. I never told them about the college acceptance letter that came in that spring. Full ride. International studies. I folded it up, tucked it between a notebook and a dream, and slid it into the back of my drawer. And the next day, I enlisted. Not because I wanted glory or structure or even purpose. I did it because they needed someone to hold the ground steady. Because I thought maybe if I did something big enough, loud enough, they'd finally see me. Years later, I still don't know if they did. But there were moments, small ones, that made me believe they might. Like when I sent my mom a photo from my first deployment, and she texted back, "Look at my girl. Strong." Or when my dad mentioned me at a barbecue and someone told me, he said, "My daughter's over there keeping the country in one piece." That kind of secondhand pride, it's slippery. You don't know if it's real or if it's just something they say when you're not in the room. Still, I held on to it. Every letter, every message, every voicemail I played on loop when things got bad. Especially this one. "Hey, it's me. Don't tell Dad I called, but I'm proud of you. We all are. Just come home safe, okay?" My brother's voice shaky but honest. That voicemail got me through more nights than I care to count. So why am I telling you this now? Because I need you to understand what it feels like to want to belong. Not just hope for it, but earn it. Work for it like it's oxygen. I didn't expect a parade. I didn't need a hero's welcome. I just thought that maybe if I showed up enough, if I gave enough, there'd be a place for me at the table without having to ask for it. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not that they forgot, but that, somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting them to remember. Last night, I found that old compass again. I wasn't looking for it. I was digging through a drawer for socks, and there it was, tangled in a piece of twine and old paper clips. The chain was dull now, and the needle spun in circles before settling south. I held it in my palm for a long time. Long enough for the cold to bite into my skin. And I realized I hadn't worn it in years. I don't even know when I took it off. Later that night, I sat at my desk, flipped through the pages of my old deployment journal, and slipped the compass between the pages. Like it still had a place, even if I didn't. I thought about that acceptance letter again. Colorado. Mountains. Languages. Piecework. All the things I once dreamed of doing before I became the one expected to hold the line. But I didn't regret my choice. Not then. Not now. Because when it came down to it, I chose them. Every time. Even when they didn't ask me to. Even when they wouldn't have done the same for me. So I folded the compass between the last page and the back cover, closed the journal, and placed it next to the flyer on my floor, the one about translating military service into civilian success. Maybe it's time to translate something else. Not just the skills, but the silence. The waiting. The weight of unspoken loyalty. Tomorrow is Sunday. Family dinner. And I'll be there. Because part of me still wants to believe that one day, they'll remember what I gave up just to stay close. But something tells me I might finally be ready to stop waiting, even if they're not ready to notice. I showed up early. Not out of excitement, just habit. 15 minutes before dinner, the sun still hanging low over the pines, cicadas buzzing like static under the sky. My hands were full. I'd picked up a small bottle of Dad's favorite BBQ rub from the commissary. Same kind he used to pile onto ribs back when we still did 4th of July cookouts together. I don't even know if he uses it anymore, but something told me to bring it anyway. The house looked exactly the same: white siding, porch swing still off balance on one side, and that little ceramic frog by the front steps that's been there since I was 12. But something felt different. Not outside. Inside me. The front door was cracked open when I got there. No greeting, no hug. Just a shouted, "Back here," from the kitchen. I walked in slowly, setting the bottle on the counter. Mom gave me a quick smile without turning her full attention away from the casserole she was flipping in the oven. "Hi, sweetie. Glad you made it." She didn't ask how I'd been. Didn't notice the bottle either. She slid it to the side with a pile of unopened mail. Dad was in the den half watching some college football game with the volume way too loud. He didn't turn around when I walked past. Just said, "Still doing that job thing." I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Didn't bother explaining that that job thing was still a blank screen and a stack of half-finished resumes. Dinner was almost ready, so I wandered into the hallway where the photo wall used to be. That spot used to be sacred. Our lives in snapshots, birthdays, Christmas mornings, graduations. And for a while, one photo of me in uniform stood right in the middle. It wasn't there anymore. In its place, a dozen new prints. My brother and his wife's baby shower, nieces at soccer tournaments, vacation in Florida, cousin's wedding. No trace of me. Except one photo where I recognized my own elbow sticking out of the corner. Someone had cropped it to focus on the cake. When dinner started, I took my usual spot far side of the table near the window. But there was no knife at my setting. Everyone else had full silverware, but mine was missing. Not a big deal. Just a detail. I reached across to the next seat and took an extra. No one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't say anything. Here's where something shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. As we all started eating, the conversations flowed like I wasn't even there. Jobs, school schedules, someone's latest home improvement project. I chimed in once, made a small comment about the weather in Colorado. Nobody followed up. It was like speaking into a void with a nice tablecloth. At some point, Dad started talking about his friend's son who just made regional manager. "He's sharp," Dad said, pointing with his fork. "Always knew how to hustle. Didn't waste years running around trying to figure it out." I felt something clench in my stomach. Like I knew what wasn't being said was louder than what was. I didn't say anything. Just chewed slowly. Swallowed. That same silence wrapped around me like a coat 2 sizes too small. After dinner, I helped clear a few plates even though Mom waved me off. "No need, we've got it," she said. So I stepped out onto the porch, needing a breath. The air was cooler than before, tinged with pine and faint smoke from a neighbor's grill. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. I stood there for a while, arms crossed, staring out into the dusk. I could hear their laughter through the screen door behind me. Someone told a joke. Silverware clinked. More laughter. I used to be in the middle of those moments. Used to be the loudest laugh in the room. Now, no one even noticed I was gone. Eventually, I slipped back inside, grabbed my keys, and told Mom I'd see her soon. She hugged me absent-mindedly, like she was thinking of the dishes still in the sink. Dad nodded from his chair without looking up. I don't even think he registered that I'd been there for more than an hour. In the car, I sat for a long time before turning the engine. The porch light flicked on behind me. I could still see everyone moving inside, tiny silhouettes through warm windows. It looked like a family. A full, well-lit picture. I was just a shadow behind the glass. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe. But part of me deep down knew better. And the thing about knowing once you see it, You can't unsee it. I didn't go straight home after dinner. I drove around for a while. Back roads mostly, the ones that wind past old tobacco barns and rusted-out mailboxes with names that haven't been checked in years. There's something about quiet roads that help you hear what you've been ignoring. By the time I pulled into my apartment, the sky had gone that heavy blue-gray that only shows up in southern dusk. I sat in the car for a minute, engine ticking as it cooled. Then I got out, walked inside, and went looking for something I hadn't touched in a long time. It was in a box marked MISC in the back of my hall closet. Inside, tangled cords, old name tags, a dusty book with the spine cracked and tucked between the pages. A letter. Crisp, even after all these years. University of Colorado Boulder. Full scholarship. Bachelor's in International Relations. Dated 2 months before I enlisted. I remember how that envelope had shimmered in my hand the day I opened it, like the future had just leaned in and whispered, "This way." But I didn't go. Let me back up for a second. At the time, my dad had just lost his 3rd job in 4 years. Mom was working double shifts at the clinic, still pretending the mortgage wasn't late, and I'd overheard them one night in the kitchen. "I don't know what else to do, Ellie. We can't ask her. We don't have to. She'll figure it out." They meant me. They didn't say it directly, but I heard it. Every syllable. That same week, I watched my mom count change at the grocery store like she was disarming a bomb. And my dad stopped opening the mail entirely. That's when I made the decision. I didn't tell them about the letter. I folded it up, slid it into a book, and signed my enlistment papers the next morning. Sometimes people ask why I joined. I always give the surface-level answer structure: service discipline, but the real reason, because it felt like the only way I could protect them without becoming a burden. Because I thought if I gave enough, I wouldn't have to ask for space at the table. It would just be there waiting for me. I pulled out that letter and ran my thumb over the edge. Still sharp. The congratulations was printed in gold. And under it, my name. Amber Reyes. Like someone once believed I belonged in a room filled with voices that spoke about global ideas and diplomacy instead of logistics routes and ration schedules. That version of me still exists. Just in a different timeline. I dug deeper into the box and pulled out a faded notebook one I used to keep in high school. The cover was a little warped, edges frayed. Inside, I'd written a list in messy black ink: live abroad, learn Spanish fluently, work with refugee children, hike the Andes, start a nonprofit, be the kind of woman 10-year-old me would look up to, protect people. I stared at that last one. Every other dream had a shaky line through it. Except that one. There was a Marine captain I served under once, Captain Halstead. Tough woman, dry humor. She told me during a midnight shift, "Reyes, you're not built just to survive. Don't trick yourself into thinking that's enough." At the time, I thought she was complimenting me. Now I wonder if she was warning me. Because for years, that's exactly what I did. I survived. I kept my head down. I stayed loyal. I gave everything I had to people who never asked where I would have gone if they hadn't needed me. I tucked the letter back into the book. Closed it. Saturday there on the floor of my apartment with that notebook in my lap. No tears. Just a stillness I couldn't name. Later that night, I went to my desk and slipped the letter folded twice into the same folder that held my resume drafts. Not because I planned to send it anywhere, but because I needed to remember that version of myself still existed. The one who thought Plan B wasn't a compromise. The one who knew how to hope. It's strange, isn't it? The way we choose things that cost us everything, and still find a way to be proud of those choices. I don't regret joining. I really don't. But sometimes I wonder what my life would have looked like if I'd let myself want more. Not for them. Not for duty. Just for me. I chose them. Every time. Even when I didn't say it out loud. Even when they never asked me to. And maybe that's what hurts now, realizing I made that choice in silence. And they never noticed. I showed up on time. Not early this time, just on time. Like a guest. The house was already buzzing when I walked in. Voices in the kitchen, laughter from the back room. No one noticed the door opening. No one turned around. I stood there for a second, holding the casserole dish with both hands. It was an old family recipe, Grandma's cornbread stuffing. The one I used to make with her every Thanksgiving. I thought maybe, just maybe, it would mean something. "Just set it over there," Mom said, motioning vaguely without even glancing. I placed it on the counter next to a tray of catered sliders and store-bought deviled eggs. No room left. Someone pushed it closer to the edge. A cousin walked by, glanced at the dish, and said, "Oh. Who brought that one?" Mom replied, "Amber, I think." No one followed up. The dining room was crowded, too many people for the table to hold. Some were already seated, others balancing plates on their laps, catching up on job promotions, baby milestones, home renovations. My name card was there, sort of. A small piece of torn paper with my name scribbled in blue ink. Everyone else had printed cards in little silver holders. I sat in the corner. My chair didn't match the others. No cushion. Slight wobble. There was no knife at my place setting. Again, I didn't bother saying anything. Just borrowed from the empty chair next to me. Funny how it doesn't take much to feel like a placeholder. Photos were passed around after the main course. My niece had just turned 8. There were party pictures, a dance recital, a family hike I clearly wasn't invited to. One of the prints made its way around the table and landed in front of me. A group shot on the back porch. Everyone smiling, arms linked. I recognized my own shoulder, half visible on the left. Cropped out. Someone joked, "Oops, who's the mystery elbow?" They laughed. I smiled. Here's where it got strange. One of the aunts started talking about family history, showing off this makeshift family tree she'd printed out from some genealogy site. She passed it around, proud. When it got to me, I looked for my name. It was there, typed in small font. No photo, no branch. Like a technicality, not a person. Later, I offered to help with dishes. Mom shook her head. "No, honey, we've got it." So I drifted. Found myself standing by the sink anyway, just out of instinct. I used to wash. Grandma dried. The sink was empty now. The hum of the dishwasher did the work. No one stood beside me. Through the kitchen window, I saw sparklers in the neighbor's yard. Their kids running barefoot, shouting, lighting up the evening with tiny explosions of joy. I used to love sparklers. Now the crackling sound just reminded me of static. When I walked back into the living room, someone was in my old spot. The armchair by the bookshelf, the one with the throw blanket I used to wrap myself in during movie nights. A cousin's boyfriend, maybe. He was texting. Didn't even look up. I stood there for a second, just watching. Not mad. Not sad exactly. Just gone. No one offered me a seat. No one said, "Oh, hey, Amber, come sit here." So I stood in the doorway, invisible. And not the magical kind of invisible you dream of as a kid. Not the cloak of adventure or secret power. This was the kind of invisible that comes from being slowly erased over time. One conversation you're not a part of. One memory you're not included in. One chair taken by someone who never knew your name. Eventually, I excused myself to the bathroom. Closed the door. Stared at my own reflection under the yellow light. Mascara still holding. Jaw clenched tight. Eyes tired. I ran my fingers over the edge of the sink and let the silence fill the room. And just like that, I knew. I was there, but not seen. And it's wild how loud that can feel. How a missing knife, a forgotten name card, and an elbow cropped from a photo can shout louder than any fight ever could. When I opened the bathroom door, the hallway was empty. Voices floated in from the other rooms, still laughing, still celebrating. But I didn't walk back in. Something had shifted. Something I couldn't pretend away anymore. I walked toward the front door. Quiet steps. No announcement. And not a single person noticed I was leaving. The porch light was still on behind me. But I didn't look back. I stepped out into the night, the screen door creaking softly as it eased shut. Behind it, laughter rose again, full and bright, like I'd never been there at all. I walked slow. No rush. Just me and the sound of gravel crunching under my boots, cicadas whispering overhead, and the distant hum of someone else's television bleeding through their open window. I didn't even make it to the car before it hit me. Not a breakdown. Not a sob. Just this strange stillness. Like every emotion had stood up and left the room before I could feel it. I stood under the oak tree by the driveway for a minute, hands in my pockets, jaw tight, shoulders locked, and I remember thinking, so this is what it feels like to disappear while standing in the middle of your own story. Let me back up a second, because there's something about silence that tricks you into thinking it's your fault. It's not like anyone said anything cruel. No one screamed. No one slammed doors. No one told me I didn't belong. But that's the thing. Sometimes the deepest cuts don't come from what people say. They come from what they no longer bother to say at all. I got in the car. Didn't start it right away. I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel staring at the porch light. No one opened the door. No one checked to see if I was okay. I was parked 3 feet from my childhood and I felt a million miles away. I think part of me was still hoping some sliver of me anyway that someone would come out. That I'd hear a voice call after me. Amber, wait. Don't leave yet. Where are you going? But there was nothing. Nothing but the air. I drove without music. Didn't even notice until I hit the main road. It was one of those drives where your hands know where to go, but your mind is nowhere near the steering wheel. Streetlights smeared into long golden ribbons and the road unfolded like it had done this 1,000 times before. I ended up downtown. Empty streets. Storefronts closed. Neon signs buzzing half asleep. And that's when I saw it. The diner. That same 24-hour spot where I used to meet up with friends after high school football games, where we'd cram into a booth and order fries we couldn't afford and laugh like we had forever. I pulled in. Didn't plan to. But the sign said open in soft red letters and something about that felt like enough. Inside it smelled like syrup and old coffee. A couple of truckers in the back. One college kid hunched over a laptop. And a waitress I didn't recognize wiping down the counter. I took a booth near the window. Saturday down. Didn't even bother with the menu. She came over, notepad ready. What can I get you on? I opened my mouth. Paused. Then said coffee. Black. She nodded. Rough night, I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. Family dinner, I said. She winced in sympathy like that explained everything. And honestly, it kind of did. When she walked away, I stared out the window. Street was quiet. Just the occasional breeze moving old leaves around like they were looking for somewhere to land. And then something strange happened. A man stood up from one of the back booths. Older. Worn cap. Military jacket faded at the seams. He walked by my table, slowly, coffee mug in one hand. Stopped. Looked at me. And just said, "Thank you for your service." That's all. Nothing more. But he meant it. I could see it in his eyes. The way he nodded once firm. The way his voice didn't dip like it was reciting something polite. It wasn't performative. It was recognition. I don't know how to explain what that did to me. After a whole evening of being invisible, of vanishing in a room full of people who shared my blood, that one sentence hit like a lifeline. My throat tightened. My hands trembled just a little. I nodded back. Didn't trust myself to speak. He left. Door chimed softly behind him, and I sat there staring into my coffee cup, suddenly unsure if I wanted to cry or laugh or run. The waitress returned with a smile. "You okay?" I blinked. Yeah, I was. Or maybe I was about to be. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I felt seen. Even if it was just for 5 seconds by a stranger in a trucker cap with calloused hands and kind eyes. Sometimes 5 seconds is all it takes to remind you you're still here. Still whole. Still real. The next morning, everything was quiet. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that feels like a held breath. Sunlight edged through the blinds, cutting across the hardwood like it had somewhere better to be. I lay there in bed fully dressed, still wearing the jeans from the night before. Didn't remember falling asleep. My phone sat untouched on the nightstand. No missed calls. No texts. It was like the world had paused. Except me. You'd think that moment in the diner, the man with the jacket, the thank you would have left me lit up. Inspired. Seen. But here's the truth. It made everything louder. Not in volume. In clarity. Because when someone finally sees you, even for a second, you realize just how invisible you've been. And worse, how long you let it happen. I got up slow. Moved through the apartment like I was underwater. The kitchen was clean. Too clean. Not a dish in the sink, not a crumb on the counter. It made me uneasy, like the space was pretending to be lived in. I made coffee. Didn't drink it. Just watched the steam curl up and vanish into the still air. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my laptop and clicked on an old bookmark buried in a folder labeled Someday. It took me to a nonprofit I used to follow, the kind that offered trauma-informed art workshops for veterans and at-risk youth. Back when I still believed in plans. They were hiring. Remote position. Digital content coordination. Outreach. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something I would have dreamed about when I was 23. I stared at the screen mouse hovering over the apply button. And then I clicked away. Here's where things got weird. Instead of applying, I opened a blank document. Typed my name at the top. Amber Reyes. Under it a headline, What I Used to Want. And just like that, it poured out. Not polished. Not even full sentences. Just fragments. I wanted to help people before they broke. I wanted to speak at schools. I wanted to start a podcast about real strength. I wanted to teach girls how to say no without apologizing. I wanted to tell stories that didn't end in silence. I wanted to matter. My hands started shaking before I even realized I was crying. And not the soft kind of crying either. This was guttural. Private. The kind that doesn't need a witness, only release. I let it happen. Saturday there for 10, maybe 20 minutes, body folded over like I was trying to hold myself together. Like pressing my ribs inward would somehow keep my chest from caving. And when it passed, when my throat stopped burning and my shoulders dropped back into place, I felt something I hadn't in months. Stillness. But this time it wasn't empty, it was spacious. I closed the laptop and walked out onto my tiny balcony. My plants were dying. I hadn't watered them in weeks, but one stubborn ivy vine was still clinging to the railing, stretching toward the sun like it refused to be ignored. I ran a finger over its leaves. Rough. Dusty. Still alive. And I whispered out loud, "You and me both." Here's the thing no one tells you about coming home from service: the silence doesn't kill you all at once. It eats around the edges. First it takes your voice in conversations. Then your name in photos. Then the space you used to take up in the room. Until one day you wake up and realize you've been shrinking so long you forgot what it feels like to take up space. I went back inside and opened the laptop again. This time I clicked on a different tab. It was a program I'd looked into once, coaching certification for veterans. Mental wellness. Storytelling, narrative therapy. I'd bookmarked it a year ago and told myself I wasn't qualified. But maybe surviving makes you qualified. Maybe being invisible gives you insight no classroom ever could. I didn't apply. Not yet. But I didn't click away either. I left it open. Let it sit there. Because even a maybe is more than I'd allowed myself in a long time. And that was the moment I realized, maybe my story wasn't ending. Maybe it was just pausing, waiting for me to catch up, to stop running from the noise, to sit in the quiet, and finally ask, what now? A few days passed. Not much changed on the surface. I still made coffee I didn't finish. Still avoided my phone. Still stared at my laptop like it held some kind of answer I wasn't ready to face. But something subtle had shifted. There was this nudge, like a tug at the back of my mind. Quiet, but persistent, like someone tapping me on the shoulder from the inside. And maybe for the first time in a while I didn't ignore it. Let me back up for a second. You know those moments where your fingers move before your brain catches up? That's how it happened. I found myself typing again another document. No title. Just thoughts. This time, it wasn't a list. It was a letter. To no one in particular. Or maybe, to every woman who's ever felt like a ghost in her own family. To every veteran who walked back into civilian life, only to feel like a stranger in both worlds. To the version of me that thought staying silent was strength. And it just spilled out. I wrote about the diner. The man in the faded jacket. The words that cracked something open. I wrote about the photo on the table where I was an elbow. The silence in the bathroom. The chair that didn't match. But more than that, I wrote about waking up. Not with fireworks or a breakdown or a revelation, but with something gentler. A choice. The next morning I did something small. I posted the letter, or part of it anyway. Just a short excerpt on a community board for female vets. Anonymous, no hashtags, no likes, just there. And I closed the laptop and went to water the plants. Didn't think twice about it. You're not going to believe this, but by that afternoon there were replies. Dozens. Women I'd never met. Some from small towns like mine. Some from cities. One from Alaska. All of them saying the same thing. I thought I was the only one. You just wrote my story. I've never said this out loud, but it wasn't validation. It was recognition. A mirror I hadn't known I'd built. That night I sat on the floor of my living room laptop on my knees, rereading the comments like they were oxygen. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel foolish for hoping. I didn't feel needy for wanting to connect. I just felt real, present, rooted, seen, not from applause, not from numbers, but from the quiet reach of story. Here's where things started moving fast. One woman messaged me privately. Said she ran a podcast about reclaiming identity after military life. Asked if I'd consider coming on and reading my letter. Said my voice could help someone still sitting in silence. At first I froze. Me, on a podcast, talking out loud. No way. But then I remembered that vine on the balcony. The one reaching toward the light even though I kept forgetting to water it. So I said yes. The day of the recording I was sweating. Hands clammy. Voice shaky. But the host was kind, calm. Made space for pauses and stumbles. I read the letter slowly. Every word felt like it was pulling something from my chest and laying it on the table. When I finished, there was silence. The good kind. Then she said, "You didn't just write a letter, Amber. You wrote an invitation." I don't think I'll ever forget that. By the next week, more messages came in. Not praise. Stories. Of mothers and daughters. Of dinner tables and unspoken grief. Of women who had built entire lives in the shadows of who they used to be. And I realized, this wasn't about me being seen. It was about creating space where others could feel less alone. I reopened the coaching program tab. This time I didn't hesitate. Filled in the application. Wrote about the podcast. About the community board. About the man in the diner. Hit submit. Then sat there in the stillness that followed. Not afraid. Not unsure. Just open. Because maybe that's what healing starts with. Not answers. Just the willingness to reach. I wish I could tell you that hitting submit on that application filled me with confidence. That I danced around my apartment or texted someone or popped open a bottle of cheap champagne. But the truth, I just closed the laptop, exhaled and sat there. Hands in my lap. Heart steady. Stillness wrapping around me like a soft blanket I didn't know I needed. It wasn't relief. Or pride. It was something older. Quieter. like recognizing a part of yourself you hadn't spoken to in years, and realizing she was still there waiting. Let me back up for a second. The podcast episode had gone live a few days before that. I didn't promote it, didn't even post a link. But somehow it found its way to the corners of the internet where stories like mine land soft and stay a while. And then my email inbox started filling up again. Women. Veterans. One man, even a widower, who said his late wife had the same look in her eyes I'd described in my story. They didn't want advice. They just wanted space. To say me too without having to perform their pain. To feel less like a headline and more like a whole person. Here's where things got weird. In the best way. One of the messages came from a woman named Lee. Turns out she ran a small women-led veteran wellness platform that focused on digital workshops, retreats, and creative expression. She asked if I'd consider running a short session, 30 minutes, no pressure. Something around storytelling and identity. I stared at her message for 15 minutes. Then I closed my laptop and went to clean the bathroom. Yeah. Avoidance at its finest. But the thought wouldn't leave me alone. I kept picturing that diner. The soft buzz of neon. The man in the jacket. How one moment one sentence had cracked something open inside me. And I started thinking, what if someone was waiting for their version of that moment? Of being called back to themselves by someone who understood. What if that someone could be me? So, I wrote her back. Said yes. Kept it casual, I can throw something together. As if I wasn't already building a slideshow in my mind and scribbling ideas on sticky notes while stirring soup. The session was over Zoom. There were maybe 20 people logged in. All those little silent squares muted Mike's cameras off, except for 2. At first I felt like I was talking into a vacuum, but then I told the story. The dinner table. The missing photo. The man who said thank you for your service. And slowly, softly squares began to flicker on. Faces appeared. Nods. Tears. Someone typed, "Keep going" in the chat. And I did. I told them about the letter. The community board. The way silence sometimes wraps itself around you like armor. Until it starts to suffocate you. I told them how sometimes healing isn't about shouting your truth. It's about whispering it. And letting someone else whisper back. When I finished, no one spoke right away. Just a beat of quiet. And then the chat lit up. I've never heard someone explain it like that. This just gave me language for something I've carried for years. Can you come back next month? That night I sat on my balcony laptop balanced on my knees, heart wide open, and I started writing again. Not for them. For me. A blog post this time. Not fancy. Not SEO optimized or keyword stuffed. Just raw. Real. Titled, "The Voice I Almost Forgot Was Mine." Because here's the truth. I'd been dancing around for years. When you grow up being told to be the strong one, to not take up space, to smile politely, to keep your hands folded and your voice small, you start to forget that your voice matters. That it has a sound, a shape, a story. And when the world finally gets quiet enough, you hear it again. Wobbly at first, then steady. Like a melody returning after a long pause. I didn't know where this was going yet. I didn't have a 5-year plan or a polished brand or a new identity to step into. But I had a thread. And I was finally ready to follow it. A week after that first workshop, I got the email. Subject line: reunion dinner this Saturday. Everyone's in town. And just like that, my stomach dropped. My cousin Madison had sent it cheerfully, reminding us that Grandma wanted all her girls under one roof for a proper family meal. Just the word family felt like a knot tightening around my chest. It wasn't about one night. It was about everything that had been buried under the surface for years. The silences. The side glances. The way my chair was always slightly pushed out from the circle. I sat there for a long time rereading that message. The old me, the one who shrank herself to keep things smooth, would have hit delete. Made an excuse. Let it go. But something in me didn't want to disappear this time. Not because I wanted to prove anything, not because I thought they'd change, but because I had. Here's where things got complicated. I didn't tell anyone I was coming, didn't text ahead, didn't ask if there'd be room. I just showed up. The house was loud, like always, voices bouncing off the hardwood floors, casserole dishes, clinking, kids darting underfoot. When I stepped through the door, no one really paused, which oddly enough gave me space. I slipped off my coat, nodded at an aunt who gave me the polite smile, and made my way to the kitchen. That's where I saw it. The table. Long wood, lovingly polished. Set for 12. And not one empty seat. At first I froze. That old burn crawled up my neck, the kind that says you knew better. But I didn't leave. I turned, found Grandma, and kissed her on the cheek. She looked surprised, tired, a little forgetful around the edges, but sweet as ever. "Oh, Amber, you made it like I was the weather." Maybe." "Yeah," I said soft. "I did." She patted my hand. "Plenty of food. Find a spot, baby." Only, there wasn't one. Let me back up for a second. When I served overseas, I ate on crates, on dirt, on a flipped-over helmet once. You learn real quick that a meal isn't about the seat, it's about who sees you. So I didn't ask anyone to scoot over. I grabbed a folding chair from the hall closet. The kind that squeaks when you unfold it. I slid it to the far corner of the table. Didn't ask. Didn't wait. And when I sat down, I did something I never used to do. I looked up. Held eye contact with whoever met my gaze. Not in defiance. Just in truth. You won't believe what happened next. One of my younger cousins, Jessie, stood up from her spot, scooted 2 chairs over, and said, "Aunt Carol, switch with me so Amber's not wedged." And just like that, the space opened up. No drama, no announcement, just space. It felt small and huge, like someone whispered, "You belong here too," not with words but with motion. Dinner carried on. Stories were shared. Laughs inside. Jokes, harmless teasing. And for once, I didn't fake laugh when something wasn't funny. I didn't shrink when someone brought up politics or war or those people who don't know how to handle life. I didn't educate them. Didn't explode. I just breathed. And in the middle of passing the mashed potatoes, my uncle turned to me and said, "So what are you up to now?" Not in mockery, in curiosity. And I told him. About the coaching certification. The podcast. The writing. The women reaching out. He blinked, nodded slow. "Huh. That's actually pretty cool." No fireworks, no applause. But not dismissal either. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't there to win anyone over. I was there to witness my own presence. To feel my body in the chair. To speak when moved. To stay when it would have been easier to leave. Later that night, as people drifted into side rooms and football came on television, I found myself standing in the hallway by a row of old photos. Family reunions. Birthdays. Me in uniform, once blurry and small. And then a voice behind me. "Jessie, you were always my favorite, you know," she said, half laughing. "You scared me a little. In a good way." I turned surprised. She shrugged. "You just always seemed like you didn't need us." And I smiled. "I did," I said. "I just didn't know how to show it." That night I left without fanfare. No big goodbyes. No drama. Just a quiet drive home, and the strange, gentle knowing that something had shifted. Not them. Me. The next morning I woke up before the sun. No alarm, just this strange weightlessness in my chest, like something had been pulled loose overnight. I made coffee in the quiet. No music. No distractions. And as the steam curled up from the mug, I sat down at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and typed 4 words I never imagined myself saying out loud, let alone writing in bold. Now accepting new clients. It didn't feel arrogant. It didn't feel premature. It felt Earned. Let me back up for a second. A few days before the dinner, Lee, the same woman who invited me to speak on that first Zoom session, had emailed me again. Said they were starting a coaching referral program, that they needed more certified coaches with trauma-informed backgrounds and storytelling experience. Said she kept thinking of me. The old me would have panicked. Would have spent 3 hours rereading my resume, questioning every comma in my bio, shrinking under the word coach like it was a size I hadn't grown into yet. But something had shifted. Not overnight, not from one workshop, but from dozens of quiet, steady moments that stitched together a kind of inner authority I didn't know I had. I didn't reply to her right away. I wanted to sit with it, to make sure I was saying yes from truth, not ego, not pressure. But that morning, post-dinner, post-small victory and folding chair courage, I knew. So I emailed back. Said I was interested. Said I'd like to schedule a call to talk logistics. 10 minutes later, she replied, "We'd be honored. You're not going to believe this, but when I told my therapist later that week, she just smiled. Like she'd been waiting for this part of the story to catch up to me. Amber," she said gently, "you're not stepping into something new. You're returning to something you were always meant to do." That landed hard. Not because I didn't believe it, but because I did. Deeply. For maybe the first time. A few days after that, I created a Substack. Simple layout, a short bio, and I called it Soft Armor. Because that's what the last few months had taught me. That strength doesn't always look like steel and sharp edges. Sometimes it looks like showing up in your own name, taking up space without apology, choosing softness as a strategy, not a weakness. My first post was a letter. Not to my readers, to myself. The version of me who sat alone on that couch listening to family talk around her like she didn't exist. The version of me who wrote letters she never sent. The version of me who waited too long to believe she mattered outside the uniform. And it began like this. "Hey you, I know you're tired. I know you think it's too late to start again. But listen, the story didn't end just because they stopped paying attention. You get to write the next part. With your name on the cover." And something strange happened after I hit publish. People responded. Not thousands, but just enough. One woman wrote, "This made me cry in the best way." Another said, "I read this aloud to my wife." She said she saw herself in every line. A man, also a vet, messaged, "I thought I was the only one who felt invisible in a room full of people who share my blood." And every single one of them said the same thing in different ways. "Thank you for saying it first. I think that's the secret no one tells you. We don't need leaders who have it all figured out. We need people willing to go first. To be seen messy. To name the thing in the room everyone else is tiptoeing around." I wasn't trying to be brave. I was trying to survive. And then somewhere along the way, I started to live. That week, I hosted my second workshop. This time, the title wasn't about trauma or pain. It was called Reclaiming the Room. We talked about presence, about voice, about chairs literal and metaphorical, and how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is pull one up for yourself and say, "I'm here," not asking, not apologizing, just arriving. At the end of the session, I left them with one prompt. What would you do tomorrow if you believed your story was enough just as it is? There was a pause. Then one by one answers rolled in through the chat. I'd speak at my daughter's school assembly. I'd finally send that essay to the publication I've been scared of. I'd call my mom. Not to argue. Just to say I'm still here. And as I watched those words fill the screen, something inside me softened. Not because I had all the answers, but because I had stopped hiding the questions. And I think that was the moment I truly came home to myself. Weeks passed. Not a lot changed in the outside world. The seasons hadn't turned yet. The same cafe on the corner still put cinnamon in their drip. But inside, I wasn't the same. It's funny how transformation doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just slips in, rearranges the furniture of your soul, and waits for you to notice. Thanksgiving came. The kind of cold gray morning that wrapped its arms around the trees and refused to let go. And for the first time in years, I didn't go home. I didn't pack a bag. Didn't bake the pie I always brought even though no one ever ate it. Didn't RSVP. Didn't explain, I just didn't go. But here's the thing. Even without me there, I heard about it. A cousin posted a group photo on Facebook, blurry and overexposed, the kind you'd scroll past without a second glance. Except for one detail, an empty chair at the end of the table. Pulled out. Not tucked in. With a name card resting on the plate. It said Amber. That's all. No caption. No tag. No story. Just that one word, like a whisper left behind in plain sight. I didn't know what to feel. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an olive branch. But it was something. Maybe a recognition. Maybe a pause. Maybe someone finally saw the space I used to fill. And then something else happened. My niece Hazel left me a voicemail. Her tiny voice crackled through the speaker like wind through dry leaves. "Hi, Aunt Amber," she said. "I drew you something. It's you. You're wearing a cape. Mommy said you help people now. Like a hero. Are you coming back?" I replayed it 3 times. 4, actually. And every time it broke me a little more gently. Let me back up. Hazel's only 6. She doesn't know what trauma coaching is. She doesn't know about service medals or silence or what it feels like to disappear in a room full of people who share your last name. But she knew enough to draw me wearing a cape. And maybe that's what mattered. I started leaving my apartment more. I walked without earbuds, without urgency. Sometimes I passed a small playground tucked behind the library. One afternoon I stood at the fence and watched a group of kids chase each other through the mulch. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled without guilt. Back home, my office had changed. The sticky notes were gone. The books organized. The whiteboard now read, "Finish what you started." Not a command. A reminder. Next to it, taped to the corner, was a small card I'd picked up at a vet-friendly job fair months ago. Veteran Career Coaching. Apply within. At the time, I'd kept it out of obligation. Now it felt earned. You're not going to believe this, but I got my first referral through Lee's network. A woman, former Army, starting over in Portland. Same age. Same silence in her chest. Our first call lasted 90 minutes. She cried, then laughed, then cried again. At the end, she whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." And without even thinking, I said it back, "Thank you for trusting me." That night, I wrote my second Substack letter. This one wasn't to myself. It was to Hazel. I didn't send it. Just wrote it, folded it, and slid it between the pages of The Things They Carried. It began. "You were right, kiddo. Capes don't always fly. Some of them sit in folding chairs, and speak last, and write quiet letters in their heads. But they're capes all the same." A few days later, I stood on my childhood porch. Nobody was home. I didn't knock. But the wind chime was still there. The one my mother swore was broken. It moved just once, as if stirred by breath instead of breeze. And maybe that's what healing sounds like. Not a trumpet. Not a drum. Just the soft echo of something that used to hurt. Finally moving. I turned to leave. No goodbye. No performance. Just a quiet, steady step away. And as I walked back to my car, I whispered something I didn't know I'd been waiting to say. "I see you." To the girl I used to be. To the woman I've become. To the silence that made space for both. And maybe that's the real ending. Not in the leaving, but in the returning to yourself. No one sat in that chair again. But they all remembered it was there. Thank you for sitting with me through this part of the story. If it made you feel something, anything, then maybe in some small way we're not as alone as we thought. Sometimes the hardest parts of life aren't loud. They're quiet. The dinner tables where no one sees you. The rooms you leave without slamming the door. But you're still here, still listening. And maybe that means you're healing too. If this story found its way to your heart, go ahead and follow or subscribe, not for me but for the next woman who needs to hear she's not invisible. I'll be back soon. With another voice, another moment, another chance to feel less alone.